The sea was in a foul mood, spitting white foam against the black, volcanic rocks. It was the kind of raw, untamed beauty I traveled for, the kind that made the solitude feel intentional rather than lonely. I was braced against the wind, my eye pressed to the viewfinder, trying to capture the precise moment a wave exploded into a cathedral of spray. The world narrowed to that single, shimmering frame. Then, a hand clamped down on my arm, hard. The grip was less an attack and more an anchor of pure desperation. I jolted, pulling back from my camera with a grunt of surprise. A woman stood over me, her body taut, her face a storm that matched the ocean. Her dark hair was whipped into a frenzy by the wind, and her eyes, wide and bloodshot, were fixed on me with an accusation so potent it felt like a physical blow. "What do you think you're doing?" Her voice was a low tremor, barely audible over the roar of the surf, but it was edged with steel. I was too stunned to answer immediately, my brain still catching up to the sudden intrusion. My first instinct was irritation. This was my space, my work. "Give me the camera," she demanded, her knuckles white where she gripped my jacket. I finally found my voice. "Excuse me? Don't play dumb." Her gaze flickered from my face to the long lens of my camera, and something in her expression tightened with a fresh wave of panic. "People like you think you can just take whatever you want. Delete it. Now." A small crowd of tourists, previously content to watch the waves from a safe distance, had started to notice. Their curious glances felt like tiny pinpricks on my skin. This was escalating into a scene, the exact kind of human drama I used my camera to avoid. I felt a flush of helpless anger. "I have no idea what you're talking about," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could. "I'm photographing the landscape." "Liar." The word was venomous. She made a lunge for the camera slung around my neck. I reacted instinctively, twisting away, my hand flying up to shield the lens. My gear was my livelihood. It was an extension of my own body. "Hey, back off." I snapped, my patience finally cracking. "I'm not deleting anything, because there's nothing to delete. You want to see? Fine." The absurdity of the situation, defending my artistic integrity against a furious stranger on a windswept cliff, was almost laughable. But there was no laughter in her eyes. There was only a profound, hunted fear. And it was that fear, more than her anger, that made me stop. Instead of arguing further, I unslung the heavy camera from my neck. Her eyes tracked my every movement, her body coiled as if ready to spring. I held it out, not as a weapon, but as an offering. I turned the small digital screen towards her, my thumb already on the playback button. "Look for yourself," I said. My voice was quiet now, stripped of its earlier frustration. The screen illuminated her face with a cool, blue light. I clicked backward through the last 30 shots. The first image appeared, a wave, caught mid-crest, its foamy edge curling like a fist. Click. Another wave, this one collapsing into a churning chaos of white water. Click. A close-up of the barnacle-encrusted rock, glistening with sea spray. Click, click, click. I watched her face as the gallery of impersonal nature shots scrolled by. The rigid line of her jaw softened. The frantic energy in her eyes began to dissipate, replaced by a slow-dawning confusion. Her grip on my arm, which I hadn't even realized was still there, loosened until her hand fell away completely. Then, we landed on the last shot I took before she grabbed me. It was mostly wave, a towering wall of dark water. But in the bottom right corner, a figure was just visible. A woman, walking along the edge of the surf, head bowed against the wind. It was her. She was a small, almost insignificant detail in the grand violence of the ocean, yet the composition had a strange, accidental power. She wasn't the subject, but her presence gave the entire scene a soul. She looked lonely, defiant, and impossibly strong, all at once. She stared at the image of herself, her breath catching in her throat. She started, but the word broke. She looked from the screen to my face, and the armor she'd worn so fiercely crumbled into dust. A wave of crimson shame washed over her features, so intense it was painful to witness. "Oh, God. I am so sorry." She wrapped her arms around herself, a sudden, protective gesture. "I thought there was this man a few weeks ago. He had a camera like yours. He followed me. He posted pictures of me online. It was bad." Her voice was thick with the memory of it. Ever since then, when I see a lens pointed my way, She didn't need to finish. I understood. I saw the phantom menace she was fighting, the invisible predator she saw hiding behind my viewfinder. I, a stranger, had unknowingly fit the silhouette of her trauma. I nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of her pain. In that moment, she was no longer an aggressor, but someone with a wound so fresh that the whole world seemed to be made of salt. The wind howled, whipping our hair across our faces, creating a curtain between us and the onlookers who were now losing interest. The moment of conflict had passed, leaving a quiet, awkward vacuum in its place. She couldn't seem to meet my eyes, her gaze fixed on the scuffed toes of her boots. The apology hung in the air, heavy and insufficient. I could have just walked away. I could have accepted her apology and retreated back into the comfortable anonymity of my work. It would have been the easier thing to do. But looking at her, hunched against the wind and her own mortification, I felt a strange sense of responsibility. My camera, an instrument of my art, had inadvertently become a trigger for her pain. I lifted the camera again, turning the screen back to the accidental portrait. "You know," I said, my tone conversational, "it's actually a pretty great shot." She flinched, as if the compliment were an accusation. "Please, just delete it." "I'm not going to do that," I said gently. "But not for the reason you think." I zoomed in on the small figure of her against the seascape. "Look. The light. The way you're braced against the wind. You don't look like a victim here. You look like you're part of the storm." For the first time, a flicker of something other than fear or shame crossed her face. It was curiosity. She leaned in closer, studying the tiny, pixelated version of herself. "When I get back to my laptop, I can edit this properly," I offered, the idea forming as I spoke. "Clean up the colors, bring out the detail. I could email it to you. No strings attached. Think of it as a different kind of picture. A counterpoint." She finally looked up, her eyes searching mine for some hidden angle, some trick. She found none. All she found was a woman with an expensive camera and an unexpected offer. "Why would you do that?" she whispered. "Because a camera shouldn't just be something that takes from you," I said, the conviction surprising even myself. "It can give you something back, too. A way to see yourself differently." I took out my phone and opened a new contact page, then held it out to her. A silent invitation. After a long moment, she took it. I watched her fingers, unsteady with lingering embarrassment, type in her name, Ava, and her email address. She handed the phone back, our hands brushing for a fraction of a second. It felt like the signing of a fragile, unspoken treaty. The misunderstanding had been a collision, but what came after felt like the beginning of a careful, deliberate reconstruction. I sent her the photograph that evening. I spent hours on it, not just performing a technical edit, but infusing it with the feeling of the moment, the strength I had seen in her stance, the resilience. I made the ocean dark and dramatic, but I made sure the light caught the line of her shoulders, turning her into a silhouette of defiance. Her reply came the next morning. It was short. "Thank you. I've never seen myself like that before." After that, our encounters in the small coastal town seemed less like coincidence and more like an unspoken arrangement. I'd see her walking on the pier, and instead of avoiding my gaze, she'd offer a hesitant wave. One afternoon, I was shooting the fishing boats in the harbor, and she approached me, her hands buried in her pockets. She watched me adjust my aperture settings for a few minutes, a quiet observer. "Does it ever get lonely?" she asked, her eyes on the horizon. "Just you and the camera." "Sometimes," I admitted. "But it's easier than dealing with people." The words were out before I could stop them. It was the most honest thing I'd said to a near stranger in years. She gave a small, wry smile. "I get that." A few days later, she asked if I could teach her. She wanted to understand how the machine worked, what all the dials and buttons meant. She said she wanted to be the one deciding what was worth capturing. I recognized the impulse immediately. It was about control. It was about taking back the power that had been stolen from her. So I started giving her lessons. We met on the beach at golden hour, the lights soft and forgiving. I put my camera in her hands. I showed her how to brace her elbows against her body for stability, how to turn the focus ring until the world sharpened into view. I saw the flicker of fascination in her eyes as she looked through the lens, suddenly the master of her own small, rectangular universe. "You're a natural," I told her, and I meant it. She had an eye for composition, for finding the beauty in the chipped paint of a buoy or the intricate pattern of foam on wet sand. Through the shared language of f-stops and shutter speeds, a bridge formed between us. My camera, which had once been the source of her terror, became our common ground. I was teaching her photography, but she was teaching me something else entirely: how to let someone into my carefully framed world. Our lessons on the beach bled into long walks through the town's winding streets. We discovered we both had a weakness for the saltwater taffy from the shop on the boardwalk and a shared dislike for the tourist trap clam chowder. The conversations started small, rooted in the safety of photography, but slowly they deepened. One night, we found ourselves sitting on a driftwood log, the tide creeping closer to our feet under a canopy of impossibly bright stars. The town was asleep, and the only sounds were the rhythmic crash of the waves and the distant clang of a buoy bell. The darkness felt like a confessional. It was then that she told me everything. Not just the abstract horror of being photographed without her consent, but the gritty, humiliating details. She told me about finding the photos on a vile corner of the internet, about the anonymous comments that picked apart every detail of her appearance and spun a false narrative about her life. She described the chilling realization that a stranger's perverse curiosity had more power over her reputation than her own truth. She spoke of losing her job as a preschool teacher because a parent found the photos and deemed her a liability. She talked about the friends who distanced themselves, their discomfort a silent judgment. She had been isolated, digitally and then physically, stranded on an island of shame that someone else had built around her. I didn't offer platitudes or easy reassurances. I just listened. I watched her profile outlined by the faint starlight, her hands clenching and unclenching in the sand. I imagined the weight of all those unseen eyes on her, and I felt a cold, quiet rage build in my chest. It was a protective anger, an emotion that was foreign to my solitary nature. When she finished, a heavy silence settled between us. The waves washed over the sand, erasing our footprints. "I feel like I'm a ghost," she whispered, her voice raw. "Like the real me disappeared, and all that's left is that girl in those pictures." I thought about the photo I had taken of her, the one where she was facing the storm. "No," I said, my voice firm in the darkness. "She's not you. We just have to remind everyone of who you really are." It wasn't a promise, exactly. It was a statement of fact. A project we were now, unspokenly, in this together. The idea came to me a few days later, fully formed and insistent. It was more than just a single photo, it was a series. A visual rebuttal. A way for Ava to not just reclaim her image, but to redefine it on her own terms. When I proposed it to her over coffee, her first reaction was fear. The thought of a deliberate photo shoot, of willingly placing herself in front of a lens again, made her physically recoil. "I can't, Evelyn," she said, shaking her head. "I don't want more pictures of me out there." "This would be different," I insisted, leaning forward. "This wouldn't be for them. It would be for you. We control everything. The location, the lighting, the story. We don't have to show your face if you don't want to. We can focus on your hands, your silhouette, the things that show your strength." I could see the battle in her eyes, the ingrained fear warring with a desperate desire to fight back. I didn't push. I just laid out the vision. Ava in the places she loved most in this town. Not posed or smiling for an unseen audience, but interacting with her world. Her hands gardening in the community plot, her shadows stretching long on the pier at dawn, her bare feet planted firmly in the wet sand as the tide retreated. It was the concept of control that finally won her over. The power to create, not to be captured. The day of the shoot was overcast, the sky soft, diffused gray that cast no harsh shadows. It was perfect. We worked in comfortable silence, a silent choreography developing between us. I'd see a shot, and she would move into the space as if she'd read my mind. There was a profound trust in her posture, a letting go that I knew was costing her immensely. The final location was the rock ledge, where we had first met. This time, there was no confrontation. She stood at the edge, facing the tumultuous sea, her back to my camera. The wind whipped the hem of her simple dress around her legs, her stance unyielding and resolute against the relentless gale. I clicked the shutter. In the frame, she was not an object of observation. She was a force of nature, as wild and powerful as the ocean she faced. We had created a new narrative. We were high on the victory of it. The photos were powerful, more so than I had even imagined. We selected a handful of the most evocative, faceless shots and, with Ava's nervous but unshakable permission, she posted them to her own, private social media. It was a quiet act of defiance, a simple statement. "This is me, the real me." The response from the small circle of friends she still trusted was a wave of overwhelming support. It felt like the first ray of sunlight after a long, Brutal winter. The feeling lasted for 48 hours. My phone buzzed with a notification. It was a link from an anonymous number with no text. I clicked it. My stomach dropped. I was looking at a post from a local online gossip forum, one known for its particular brand of small-town cruelty. The title of the thread was, "Traumatized Teacher's Miraculous Recovery for Clout?" Beneath it were our photos. Or a bastardized version of them. Someone had taken screenshots, crudely cropping out the watermarks. But that wasn't the worst part. They had also posted several other photos, grainy, long-lens shots of us during the photo shoot. Me directing her laughing at something I said. The caption was pure poison, suggesting the entire cyber harassment story had been a hoax, a convoluted scheme cooked up by the two of us to launch her influencer career, with me as the mastermind photographer. It painted her as a manipulative fraud and me as a predatory opportunist. They had taken our act of reclamation and twisted it into something ugly and transactional. They had turned our sanctuary into a spectacle. I immediately tried to call Ava, but the call went straight to voicemail. I sent a text. "Ava, don't look at it. We'll handle this." No reply. I drove to her small apartment by the harbor. I knocked, then knocked again harder. The lights were on, but there was no answer. I stood on her doorstep for a long time, the sea breeze feeling cold and sharp against my skin. She was in there, I knew it, and in her silence, I could feel the foundation of our friendship cracking under the weight of this new, calculated violation. Her old trauma had been a stranger's malice. This one felt like a betrayal from the inside. And in her mind, I was the one holding the knife. The next few days were an exercise in quiet dread. My calls went unanswered. My texts were left on read, a small, blue monument to her refusal to engage. I saw her once, from a distance, walking quickly into the grocery store, her shoulders hunched and a baseball cap pulled down low. She didn't see me, or if she did, she gave no sign. The space between us, once filled with the easy rhythm of growing trust, was now a chasm of silence. Every instinct screamed at me to go to her house, to bang on the door until she answered, to plead my case, to tell her that I had nothing to do with this, that the very idea was a sickening insult to what we had built. But I knew it would be useless. Words were hollow things in the face of her renewed trauma. Her trust hadn't just been broken, it had been pulverized, confirming her deepest fear that everyone, eventually, would exploit her vulnerability. For me to show up, desperate and defensive, would only make me look guiltier. I felt the sting of her suspicion, a sharp, personal ache. But beneath it, a different feeling began to solidify, a cold, methodical anger. This wasn't about my hurt feelings. It was about the fact that someone had, for a second time, weaponized a camera against her. And this time, they had used my own work to do it. I couldn't fix this with words. I couldn't undo the damage with an apology or an explanation. The only way to earn back her trust was to demolish the lie. And to do that, I couldn't be a friend pleading for forgiveness. I had to be a photographer defending her work and a woman protecting another woman. So, I turned to the only tools I truly trusted, my expertise and my patience. I retreated to my small rental cottage, opened my laptop, and went to work. The silence from her end was deafening, but I let it be. My actions would have to be my voice. My world shrank to the glow of my laptop screen. I operated on coffee and a simmering rage, channeling all my energy into a digital counteroffensive. I started with a gossip forum. I spent hours documenting every libelous comment, every instance of the stolen images, and filed detailed copyright infringement and defamation reports with the platform's hosting service. I didn't just report the post. I built a case citing their terms of service, showing a pattern of targeted harassment. Then I moved on to the behind-the-scenes photos. They were amateurish, clearly taken from a distance. I analyzed the metadata, but it was stripped. So I went back to the source, the location. I pulled up my own files from that day, cross-referencing the angle of the sun, the shadows, the tide. The candid shots were taken from an upstairs window of the old, dilapidated bait-and-tackle shop that overlooked that part of the beach. It was a long shot, but I looked up the shop's social media page. I scrolled through weeks of posts until I found him. A young man who worked the counter, an aspiring paparazzo who had posted blurry photos of tourists before. On his personal page, I found a photo of him with a new telephoto lens, posted the day after our shoot. The caption read, "New toy paid for itself already." Digging deeper, I found his private replies to commenters on the forum, bragging about how easy it was to spin a story about two lonely women for clicks and cash. The pieces clicked into place with a nauseating certainty. This wasn't some grand conspiracy. It was the casual, thoughtless cruelty of a bored opportunist who saw two women and smelled a story he could sell for a few $100s. I saved everything. Screenshots, links, archived pages. I compiled a timeline linking his social media posts to the appearance of the story on the gossip forum. I was building an invisible shield around Ava, one piece of irrefutable evidence at a time. I didn't sleep much. In the quiet hours before dawn, I would look out at the dark ocean and think of her, alone in her apartment, believing I had betrayed her. The thought didn't deter me. It fueled me. Gathering the digital evidence was only the first step. Deleting posts on a forum was like cutting the head off a hydra. More would just grow in its place. The source needed to be neutralized. My professional network, once a tool for finding freelance gigs, became an arsenal. I reached out to a contact in San Francisco, a lawyer who specialized in intellectual property and online harassment. I sent her a concise, professional email detailing the situation, attaching the folder of evidence I had meticulously compiled. I offered to pay her retainer myself. She responded within an hour. She was impressed with the thoroughness of the documentation and, moved by the story, connected me with a nonprofit organization called the Digital Sanctuary Project. They provided pro bono legal services to victims of cyber exploitation. They were exactly what we needed. I spent the next 2 days on the phone with a sharp, no-nonsense attorney from the project. I walked her through every piece of evidence, every link, every screenshot. I was Ava's proxy, her advocate, speaking with a clarity and detachment that I knew Ava herself, trapped in the emotional vortex of the situation, couldn't possibly muster right now. The lawyer drafted a formidable cease and desist letter addressed to the young man at the bait-and-tackle shop. It detailed the copyright infringement of my photos, the violation of Ava's privacy, and the defamatory nature of the narrative he had sold. It threatened legal action that would cost him far more than his new lens. A separate, equally menacing letter was sent to the gossip forum's parent company, demanding full removal of the content and a formal apology for enabling targeted harassment. I worked with a calculated precision, walling off my own emotions. This was a job, a problem to be solved. But as I printed the final copies of the legal notices, the paper warm from the machine, I felt the weight of what I was doing. This wasn't just about taking down a post. It was about rebuilding a world for Ava where she could feel safe again. A world where she knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that someone had her back. Within 48 hours of the letters being sent, the forum took down every trace of the defamatory thread. The young man deleted all his social media posts related to the incident and posted a public, unreserved apology on the town's community page, admitting he had fabricated the entire story for profit, taken the photos without consent, and caused irreversible harm to Ava and me. The apology spread like wildfire through the town, turning the tide of public opinion completely in our favor. With the legal letters sent and the takedown notices propagating across the web, there was nothing left to do but wait. And to see her. I assembled a simple, thick manila folder. Inside, I placed copies of everything, the screenshots of the forum before and after the posts were removed, the digital forensics report tracing the leak to the bait shop employee, the copies of the cease and desist letters stamped by the law firm, the email confirmations from the platform moderators, and a screenshot of his public apology. It was a complete, irrefutable narrative of the past week. I walked to her apartment in the late afternoon. The air was still and heavy. I knocked on the door, my heart a slow, heavy drum in my chest. This time, she opened it. She looked exhausted. The vibrant energy I had come to associate with her was gone, replaced by a dull, weary guardedness. She didn't speak, just looked at me, her expression a flat, unreadable wall. I didn't try to explain. I didn't apologize for the silence. I simply held out the folder. "This is for you," I said. She stared at it, then at me, her brow furrowed in suspicion. Hesitantly, she took it. Her fingers brushed mine, and I felt a jolt, a static shock of the distance that had grown between us. She didn't invite me in. She just stood in the doorway, the folder held loosely in her hand. I nodded once, and turned to leave. "Evelyn," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. I stopped but didn't turn around. "Wait." I waited, my back to her, listening to the sound of her opening the folder, the rustle of papers. I heard a sharp intake of breath, then another. Silence stretched, punctuated only by the cry of a distant gull. When she spoke again, her voice was choked. "You did all this?" I turned slowly. She was standing there, the papers unsteady in her grip, her eyes wide with a dawning, devastating realization. The wall she had built around herself was gone, and in its place was a raw, aching vulnerability. Tears began to trace paths down her cheeks. "You did all this, and you didn't say anything." "Words wouldn't have helped," I said softly. "Only the truth would." She looked down at the proof in her hands, then back at me, a sob catching in her throat. The folder slipped from her grasp, its contents scattering across her welcome mat like fallen leaves. And then she closed the distance between us and wrapped her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder. It wasn't a hug of forgiveness. It was a plea for anchor in a world that had, once again, spun out of control. I held her, steady and silent, until the storm passed. We sat in her small living room, the scattered papers from the folder now neatly stacked on the coffee table between us. The sun was setting, casting long, warm stripes of light across the floorboards. Ava was curled into the corner of her sofa, clutching a mug of tea, her face still blotchy from crying. "I'm so sorry, Evelyn," she said, her voice barely a whisper. The moment I saw that post, I spiraled. It felt exactly like before. The shame, the feeling of being exposed. And it was easier to believe you had used me than to believe it could happen all over again. I nodded, understanding completely. Your trust was a fragile thing, Ava. And the world had already given you every reason to break it. But you never broke it, she insisted, her eyes locking with mine. You built a fortress around me while I was hiding. I thought you were the enemy, and you were out there, being my entire army. We talked for hours as the light faded, not about the specifics of the legal letters or the malice of the forum, but about the architecture of trust itself. We talked about how quickly it can be demolished and how painstakingly it must be rebuilt. We spoke of the insidious way the world can make women doubt each other, can position them as competitors or threats, especially when they are vulnerable. He took your art and tried to turn it into a weapon against us, she said, gesturing to the stack of papers. And you took his weapon and dismantled it, piece by piece. In the quiet aftermath of the storm, a new clarity settled between us. The misunderstanding hadn't just been resolved, it had been transformative. Our friendship, forged in a confrontation and deepened through shared vulnerability, had now been stress-tested by the worst kind of betrayal, a perceived one, and had not only survived, but had emerged stronger, its foundations reinforced with proof of a loyalty that ran deeper than words. It was a bond that no longer needed to be spoken. It simply was. A few evenings later, we were back on the beach, sitting on the same driftwood log where she had first shared the full story of her trauma. The tide was out, leaving a vast expanse of gleaming, wet sand that reflected the bruised purple and soft pink of the twilight sky. A comfortable silence stretched between us, the kind that only exists between people who have nothing left to prove to one another. "I've been thinking," I said, breaking the quiet, "about what comes next, for me." She turned to look at me, her expression open and curious. "I came to this town to be alone," I continued, watching the distant lights of a container ship on the horizon. My camera was my shield. It kept me at a safe distance from everything. But what happened these last few weeks, helping you, fighting for you, it was the most engaged I've felt with the world in years. And it wasn't through a lens. I paused, gathering my thoughts. I don't want to just drift to the next town anymore. I think I want to build something here. I looked at her, a half-formed idea taking shape in my mind. I was thinking about a studio, a small one, a place where women can come and be photographed, but on their own terms, not to be beautiful or sexy or anything for the male gaze, just to be seen for who they are, a kind of sanctuary. Ava was quiet for a long moment, her gaze distant. I thought maybe I had overstepped, that my personal revelation was a burden. Then she turned to me, and her eyes were shining with an intensity that took my breath away. "Not just you, Evelyn," she said, her voice low but firm. "Us." My heart gave a lurch. "Us." "You have the eye and the skill," she said, a smile finally breaking across her face, the first genuine, uncomplicated smile I had seen in weeks. "And I have the experience. I know what it feels like to be on the other side of that lens. I know what these women need to feel safe. I can run the space, talk to them, make them feel at home before they even step in front of your camera." The idea settled over us, shimmering in the twilight air. It wasn't just a business plan. It was a mission, a defiant, joyful act of creation born from the ashes of a destructive one. It was the logical conclusion to our entire story. "So," she said, her smile widening. "Partners?" "Partners," I agreed, and the word felt solid, real, a promise of a future I had never dared to imagine. Finding the space was the easy part. A small, forgotten storefront near the harbor, with a salt-bleached wooden facade and large, north-facing windows that let in the most beautiful, diffused light. The hard part was the work. We spent a month stripping old paint, sanding floors until our arms ached, and haunting flea markets for furniture that felt comfortable and lived in. Ava had a vision for the front room. Not a sterile waiting area, but a cozy lounge with overstuffed armchairs, shelves of art books, and a perpetually brewing pot of herbal tea. It was to be a space for decompression, for conversation. We called it Refuge Studio. The name felt right. Our first client was a local librarian in her 60s who wanted a portrait that captured her love of books, not one that tried to make her look younger. I photographed her in her favorite armchair, surrounded by towering stacks of novels, her face illuminated by a single, soft light, her expression one of quiet contentment. Word spread through the town's quiet network. A young woman came in who was recovering from an eating disorder. She wanted to document her journey of healing, capturing her form not as an object of criticism, but as a testament to her resilience and survival. Ava sat with her for an hour, just talking, before I even took my camera out of its bag. A mother of 3 came in, exhausted and feeling invisible. She left with a powerful, unsmiling portrait that reminded her of the fierce woman she was beneath the surface of her daily life. Ava was the heart of the studio. She was the gatekeeper of the sanctuary, the one who created the atmosphere of profound safety and acceptance that allowed our clients to be vulnerable. I was the quiet observer in the background, the one who translated that vulnerability into a tangible image, a piece of truth they could hold in their hands. We worked like 2 sides of the same coin, a seamless partnership built on a shared purpose. Our own story became the unspoken foundation of everything we did. Months later, the young man from the bait shop showed up at the studio door, his head bowed, clutching a handwritten apology. Ava stepped outside to meet him, her posture calm and steady. She listened to his words, then told him she did not owe him forgiveness, and that his amends needed to be in the work he did to never harm anyone else again. She closed the door gently, and when she turned back to me, there was no trace of fear in her eyes, only quiet, unshakable power. 1 year to the day after we opened the studio, we closed up shop early. The sky was clear, and a warm breeze was blowing in off the water. Without a word, we both knew where we were going. We walked down to the beach, our shoes in our hands, and made our way to the outcropping of black rock where our story had begun. We sat side by side, watching the waves roll in, their rhythm as steady and predictable as the turning of the earth. So much had changed. The woman beside me was not the frantic, terrified stranger who had grabbed my arm in a blind panic. Her eyes, once clouded with fear, were now clear and bright. The solitude I had once craved had been replaced by a partnership that felt more grounding than any landscape I had ever photographed. Our studio was thriving. It had become more than a business. It was a small but vital hub in the community, a place where the stories of women were honored and preserved. Our friendship, a fragile sapling born from a violent misunderstanding, had grown into something strong and deeply rooted, unshakable. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and gold. Ava leaned her shoulder against mine, a simple, comfortable gesture. We didn't need to talk about the journey we had been on. We were living it. A wave crashed against the rocks below us, sending a fine mist of salt spray into the air. It felt like a benediction. I looked at Ava, her profile etched against a vibrant sunset, and I thought about the first photograph I ever took of her, the accidental one. The girl in that photo was a stranger braced against a storm. The woman next to me now was the calm in the heart of it. We had faced down the ugliest parts of the world together and had responded by building something beautiful in its place. Our story, and the stories of all the women who walked through our studio door, were now interwoven, a tapestry of shared strength. The future was an unwritten page, but for the first time in my life, I wasn't afraid to turn it. I knew, with absolute certainty, that I wouldn't be turning it alone.